Chapter 40 of Carpenter's Geographical Reader, North America. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. Carpenter's Geographical Reader, North America, by Frank G. Carpenter. Chapter 40. Alaska and the Seal Islands. The northwestern part of North America belonged to the Russians until 1867, when they sold it to the United States. It then became a part of our country under the name of the Territory of Alaska. Alaska is so far away, however, and parts of it are so covered with snow and ice that we cannot yet know much about it. We hardly realize what a big country it is. It is said to contain about 1/6 of all the land in our country, and to be so large that the New England states could be stored away in one corner of it. Alaska is a land of high mountains, of mighty glaciers, and of inland seas filled with icebergs. Here and there, arms of the ocean run into the country for many miles, and it has one river, the Yukon, which is navigable for small steamers for a greater distance than the length of the Mississippi River between New Orleans and St. Paul. The glaciers of Alaska are among the largest in the world. Upon the western slope of Mount St. Elias, there are 11 enormous blocks of ice moving down toward the water. One of these ice blocks is 50 miles long and 20 miles wide, and another, as we see it from our steamer, is a wall of ice 200 feet high and 5 miles wide, and it stretches back as far as our eyes can reach. The Alaskan glaciers are wonderfully beautiful. The ice is of the clearest blue, and the glaciers look like huge blocks or walls of sapphire. They look as though they were great torrents of water which had been frozen as they were about to plunge into the sea. Take the Muir Glacier, for instance, which faces the sea on Glacier Bay. If you could double the height of Niagara Falls and make it twice as wide, and then freeze the whole mass of sparkling water as it falls, you might have some idea of this wonderful glacier. You must, however, imagine a background of great mountains covered with snow, and a bright sun which lights up the icicles so that they shine with all the hues of the rainbow. Such glaciers are always moving downward, and parts of them every now and then break off and tumble into the sea. As they break, there is a noise like thunder. The piece falls down, down, down under the water. The water boils, the waves roll, and a moment later a great iceberg rises to the surface. In traveling through these seas, we are seldom out of sight of icebergs, and we must be very careful to have our ship out of the way when a glacier breaks and an iceberg is formed. But it must be very cold where there is so much snow and ice, must it not? Yes, the most of Alaska is covered with snow the greater part of the year. The winters are very long and cold, and the summers short. Much of western Alaska, however, is so affected by winds from the warm Japanese current that some parts of it, especially those near the coast, are quite habitable for civilized man. We find the climate of Sitka, for instance, mild. The thermometer there seldom gets below 0 in the winter, nor does it rise much above 80 in the summer, although it rains or snows during the greater part of the year. As we sail along the coast of this part of the territory, we pass forests almost as dense as those of Louisiana or Florida. There are wild hops, wild onions, and wild berries of many kinds. The raspberries are delicious, and at the entrance to Glacier Bay there is a place known as Strawberry Point, where there are so many wild strawberries that when they blossom the land looks like a field of daisies, and when they ripen, the berries fairly make the ground red. There is much grass on the islands of western Alaska, and even upon the coast of northern Alaska. Along the Arctic Ocean, dandelions and buttercups blossom in July and August, although they have only a few days to live. The people who inhabit Alaska are mostly Eskimos and Indians. The Eskimos are found not only here, but in many of the very cold parts of North America. They are shorter than our Indians. They have coarse black hair, black eyes, high cheekbones, and broad, flat noses. They dress in furs, both men and women being clad in fur from head to foot, and having fur hoods which they draw up over their heads. In the colder parts of Alaska, many have a second garment of fish skin, which they wear over the furs. The fish garment is considered a very desirable one, for in case of necessity its owner can eat it. Both men and women often wear pieces of bone and ivory in their lower lips and noses as ornaments, and many tattoo their faces. The Eskimos live for the most part on fish and seals. They are fond of all kinds of fats, and it is said that they will eat tallow candles if they have but little food. One missionary who traveled through Alaska says that he had great trouble keeping his castor oil, for the natives looked upon it as a delicious foreign drink. He had to limit his prescriptions to 1 dose at a sickness, and would never allow a patient to have more than 4 tablespoonfuls at one time. We see many Indian villages as we sail along the coast. The most of the Indians of southern Alaska have their towns upon the beach, first because they get their living from the sea by fishing, and second because the forests, except along the beaches, come close to the water's edge. Many of the towns consist of but one row of wooden huts, in front of each of which stands a great carved pole or post called a totem. The totems are from 30 to 50 feet high, and in the distance they make you think of a forest of dead trees until you come closer and see the houses below them. These totems are covered with carvings of different animals and birds. Upon some of them are bears, whales, eagles, or ravens. Others have grotesque figures of men. They might be called the coats of arms or memorial posts of the natives, and are not idols, as has been sometimes supposed. As we sail farther north, we still find that most of the villages are near the coast. Many of the houses are underground, being made so for greater warmth. In the summer, many of the Eskimos live in skin tents, and in winter they often make a tent of pure ice, stretching their summer tent of skin over the top as a roof. They keep their houses a little warm with stove lamps, but as a rule they rely chiefly upon their clothing for heat. They travel from place to place upon snowshoes, carrying their household goods on sledges drawn by dogs or reindeer. The chief things for which Alaska is valuable to us are its fish, furs, and minerals. The fish of Alaska are caught by the millions every year and are shipped to the markets of our country and Europe. During certain seasons the salmon come into the rivers in such droves that they almost fill them, and there are immense factories in which they are cured and canned. Great quantities of codfish and herring are caught, and the whaling industry also is quite valuable. The furs of Alaska have, however, been worth much more to us than the fish. On some of the Alaskan islands are the great seal-catching grounds of the world. The skin of the fur seal is used to make sealskin coats and jackets. The seals are among the queerest of animals. They are quite large, the males often weighing 500 pounds and the females about 1/5 as much. The seal has beautiful eyes of a bluish hazel or black, which change in expression when he is angry or good-humored. His mouth and jaw are not unlike those of a Newfoundland dog, save that the lips are more firmly pressed together. He has flippers under his body. Those at the shoulders look like a pair of black hands, the arms being concealed under the skin, and the hind flippers take the place of legs and feet. Each seal has 2 coats of fur. One is a short, crisp, bristly one of hair, and under this there is a soft, close one of a down-like fur. One of the queerest things about the seals is the summer trip which they all make to Alaska. Is it not strange to think of an animal having a summer home? This is the case with the seals. During the winter they live in the warm waters of the Pacific Ocean, far south of Bering Sea. Every spring they come northward by the tens of thousands. They swim on until they reach 4 little islands known as the Pribilof Islands, in the heart of Bering Sea. Here they climb up on the rocks and stay until cold weather comes, when they again swim south to spend the winter. It is upon these islands that all the young seals are born. The male seals come first, and pick out the spots where they are to live with their families. Then, a few weeks later, the females are seen swimming in, and soon the island is covered with little colonies of seals, each of which keeps, to a certain extent, to itself. The baby seals make us think of young dogs, and their cry is like the bleating of a lamb. The mother calls her little ones to her with a noise like that of a sheep, and the little seals play about together much like little puppies. When they are about 6 weeks old, they go into shallow pools and learn to swim, and as they get stronger, they roll down into the sea and take excursions of miles. The seals are so valuable that men are allowed to kill only a few of them each year. The ones chosen are males from 3 to 4 years old. They are not at all hard to catch, for they are not much afraid, and they can easily be driven off in herds or droves, apart from the others. The seal hunters carry clubs about 7 feet long and as thick as baseball bats. They stun the animals by striking them on the skull, and then other men come along with sharp knives and kill the poor beasts. The skins are then taken off carefully and laid in large piles, with layers of salt between them. After being thoroughly salted, they are done up in square bundles and shipped to London, where all the fur sealskins are dressed. This is done by shaving the skin very thin. This cuts off the roots of the stiff hairs which form the outer coat, but does not touch the roots of the downy fur below. The long hairs are now brushed off, and the downy fur is dyed black or a rich brown, just as you see it on sealskin coats. The minerals of Alaska are very valuable. Vast quantities of gold have been discovered in different parts of the territory. As we sail from Puget Sound to Sitka, we go by Douglas Island, on which is the famous Treadwell mine, out of which vast quantities of gold have been taken. The sands of some of the islands of Alaska are mixed with gold, and on the island of Kodiak men are to be seen who are washing the sand to get out the gold. End of chapter 40. Chapter 41 of Carpenter's Geographical Reader, North America. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. Carpenter's Geographical Reader, North America, by Frank G. Carpenter. Chapter 41. British America. There are several ways by which we can go from Alaska into British America. We might sail back to Puget Sound and thence cross the southern parts of British Columbia and Canada by the Canadian Pacific Railroad, but we prefer to go up the wide Yukon River into the Canadian Dominion. In 1897, rich discoveries of gold were made on the Klondike, a branch of the Yukon. Since then, thousands of men have gone there for gold. They have to undergo more hardships than the miners we saw farther south. The summers are very short, and the ground is frozen about 2/3 of the year. Most of the gold is washed out of the earth along the streams. During the winter, fires are built on the ground to take out the frost. Then the gold-bearing earth is dug up and carried to the stream, and piled up there to remain until summer melts the ice and gives the miners water with which to wash out the gold. We travel many days before we reach the gold fields. We go on through the regions of the Klondike to Dawson City, and then prepare for our long trip through one of the wildest parts of North America. We leave the Yukon, and with sledges and dogs to haul our camping outfit, we make our way over the passes of the Rocky Mountains to the Mackenzie River. We then move back toward the south and cut our way through the forests to Hudson Bay. Finally, after a long and weary journey, we come down into the more settled parts of Canada. As we travel through the northern parts of our continent, we are amazed at its extent and curious features. There is so much of it that it would take years to explore it. Great Britain owns almost as much land in North America as the United States. British America is about 40 times as big as Great Britain. It comprises 1/3 of the whole British Empire and almost 1/15 of all the land on the globe. We travel for days in the upper part of this vast territory. It is so far north that the trees are stunted by the cold and never grow higher than a 2-year-old child, and we can hardly realize that we are in the same country past which we sailed as we left Puget Sound on our way to Alaska. The southwestern part of British Columbia is well wooded. It has fir trees and cedars almost as tall as the tallest church steeple. British America, in fact, contains the greater part of the trees now left in North America. From Hudson Bay to the head of Lake Superior, there is an almost unbroken line of forest, and going some distance north of this, you could travel from the Atlantic to the Rocky Mountains and never get out of the woods. The most of this country is as wild as it was when Columbus discovered America. We sometimes go for days without seeing a white human being. In the extreme north we meet a few Eskimos in furs and now and then an Indian from one of the tribes of the north. There are in all British America only about 120,000 Indians scattered over the country in wandering tribes. The white people, including those of the cities, are not more in number than the population of the state of New York, and in the far north we meet no whites at all, except now and then an agent of the Hudson Bay Company. We often stop with these agents as we go on our way. Each of them has a little store filled with goods for trading with the Indians, and we see these people bring in all kinds of furs and trade them for powder, glass beads, blankets, and other things. For more than 200 years, the Hudson Bay Company has controlled the fur trade of British America. It has its agents now everywhere in these cold regions, and its members have grown rich by trading with the trappers and Indians. The Hudson Bay Company was organized in 1670. At that time, King Charles II of England gave a party of Englishmen the exclusive right to trade with the Indians in the basin of Hudson Bay. After a time, they controlled the whole of the territory between the coast of Labrador and the Rocky Mountains, and had in their employment hundreds of agents and traders, besides many Indians. But could they find much of value in this wild and desolate region? Yes, indeed. The Canadian Dominion is one of the great fur lands of the world. In its forests are great numbers of deer, bear, minks, foxes, and wolves. There are also beavers and otters in its rivers and lakes. Millions of skins and furs are yearly bought by the agents of this company and shipped to London, where they are prepared for the markets of the world. The Indians do not receive money for the furs and skins which they sell. The trade is carried on by barter, of which the unit of account is the beaver skin. One beaver pelt is worth 20 muskrat skins or 2 marten skins, and a silver fox is worth 5 beavers. The Hudson Bay Company send out blankets, beads, knives, and other things to their trading posts, and the Indians know very well just how much they should get for their skins. The agents of the Hudson Bay Company tell us that they are often a year without seeing a white man. This is especially the case with the agents near the coast of Hudson Bay. These men are visited by ships from Great Britain only once a year. The ships enter the bay about the middle of July, bringing supplies for the agents. They leave it about the middle of September, loaded with skins and furs for London. We find no lack of either game or fish in our journey. We live in large part on what we shoot on the way. We now and then kill caribou or small deer, and are very proud when we bring down our first moose. Moose hunting is by no means child's play. Many of the male deer of this species are 8 feet high, and their enormous antlers, or horns, are so large that from tip to tip they sometimes measure 6 feet. The best time to hunt moose is in the winter. Our Indian guides go with us, and we soon find a moose yard. This is the name of the spots in the swamps where the moose have regular feeding grounds. We find the yard by the tracks of the moose in the snow, and we prepare for our hunting by putting on snowshoes, for in these we can run rapidly, while the moose, being very heavy, will sink down through the crust and cannot escape. Now we are near the yard. We hide behind the trees with our guns at our shoulders. The Indian guides call the moose by imitating their cry, and soon the great creatures are seen making their way through the snow. They seem suspicious, but the wind is blowing toward us, and they cannot scent our presence. We aim very carefully and bring down the game at the first shot. Had we not done so, the moose might have turned upon us and crushed us with its horns. The big animal is a fierce fighter when wounded, and for that reason it is a good thing to have a repeating rifle when you are hunting such game. In the western part of British America, we find panthers, grizzly bears, and mountain sheep. The grizzlies stay in the gloomiest parts of the Rocky Mountains. They are enormous beasts, and the persons who hunt them take their lives in their hands. The mountain sheep are found high up in the hills, above where the grizzlies live. They are very sure-footed, jumping from rock to rock, and are exceedingly difficult to kill. There is excellent fishing in all parts of Canada. The lakes and streams are alive with fish, and we catch all sorts of the finny tribe, from the sweet-fleshed brook trout to the great salmon which weighs as much as a good-sized baby. Had we time to spend a summer in the Arctic Ocean, about the mouth of the Mackenzie, we might even catch whales, for here is one of the best whaling grounds in the world. The steam whale ships, which we saw at the San Francisco docks, go to the mouth of the Mackenzie, and sometimes vessels winter there, being frozen in the ice. In former times whales were caught chiefly from sailing vessels. The seamen, as soon as they got near enough to a whale, threw a harpoon with a rope attached into it. The sharp arrow-like head of the harpoon stuck into the whale's flesh, and the great creature struggled in the water until it was tired out and could be killed. It was cut up in the water, and the huge pieces of whale blubber were raised to the ship's deck to be made into oil. Now much whaling is done by little steamers which carry cannon and shoot the harpoons into the whales. To the harpoons are attached ropes, which are also fastened to the ships, and it is not a hard matter to kill a whale when once the harpoon is in him. Whales are also caught off the coast of Greenland, and they are often captured in the waters along the coast of Labrador and in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. They are valuable for their oil as well as for their bones. The whalebone is taken from the mouths of the whales. The Canadian saltwater fisheries are very extensive. You have heard of the banks of Newfoundland? These are the greatest fishing grounds that have ever been known. Just south of the island of Newfoundland, there is a plain under the sea, about 200 miles long and 70 miles wide, where codfish, herring, and mackerel come by the millions to feed. These fishes are fond of cold water, and the Arctic current, which washes the coast of Labrador, brings down a sort of slime containing sea life which forms their favorite food. The waters here are covered, the greater part of the time, with fogs. Now and then huge icebergs float through them, and fishing is exceedingly dangerous. Still, fishing vessels come here from all parts of the world, and more codfish are caught on the Grand Banks of Newfoundland than anywhere else in the world. There are so many cod caught, in fact, that if the dried codfish exported in 1 year should all be sent to the United States, there would be more than enough to give every man, woman, and child in our country a pound and a half. Much of the best mackerel comes from Canada, and an army of fishermen is engaged in catching herring in nets, and in smoking, pickling, or curing them in other ways for the markets of the world. End of chapter 41. Chapter 42 of Carpenter's Geographical Reader, North America. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. Carpenter's Geographical Reader, North America, by Frank G. Carpenter. Chapter 42. The Cities of Canada. The Dominion of Canada includes the whole of British America except Newfoundland and Labrador. Of the 5 million people who inhabit this vast territory, almost all live near the extreme southern edge of the country. We can take a flying railroad trip from west to east and visit almost every large Canadian city on the way. We start at Victoria, on the island of Vancouver. This is the capital of British Columbia. It lies on a beautiful harbor overlooking the Straits of Juan de Fuca and the Gulf of Georgia. It has only about 20,000 people, and we are surprised to see many Japanese and Chinese who have come here on the steamships which stop at Victoria on their way from China and Japan to Vancouver. Within 2 miles of the city is the chief naval station of Great Britain on the Pacific Ocean. It is known as Esquimalt. We visit it, going thither on electric cars, and look at the British men-of-war which lie in its harbor. There is an immense dry dock at Esquimalt, in which the war vessels are cleaned of the barnacles that gather on their hulls. There is a man-of-war lying in it at the time of our visit, and we watch the men scouring and scraping to get the ship clean. From Victoria we go by steamer to Vancouver. The trip takes about half a day. We cross the Gulf of Georgia, ride under the shadow of the white cone of Mount Baker, and come to anchor at the chief commercial port of Great Britain on the Pacific. A steamer which has just come from Asia is lying beside us, and we watch the men unload packages of tea and other goods from China and Japan, and put them into the cars of the Canadian Pacific Railroad, which is to carry them to the east. It is by the Canadian Pacific that we shall journey from one side of Canada to the other. There is a train every day, but we feel tired at the thought that the iron track in front of us goes on without stopping for a distance of 2,900 miles toward the sunrise. We travel for miles through country which is heavily wooded, the fir trees in some places rising to a height of 300 feet. We skirt the Fraser River, whose sands are said to contain much gold dust, and go on until we find ourselves in the heart of the Rockies. We rise higher and higher, passing through some of the grandest scenery in the world. We fly past glaciers. We ride for miles in the snow and then shoot down the sides of the mountains to the lower slopes, which are covered with a dense growth of green. The first large town east of the Rockies is Calgary, a little city of about 5,000 people, which is a supply point for the cattlemen who graze their herds in the country nearby, and also for the miners who work in this part of the Rockies. Going on eastward, we pass through miles and miles of grazing land, getting a view now and then of an antelope in the woods, and passing here and there prairie dog villages at the side of the track. We stop at Regina. This is a little town of about 3,000 people. It is the capital of the Northwest Territory and is known as being the chief station of the Mounted Police. The Mounted Police is a military organization of 1,000 soldiers, whose business it is to look after the Indians and keep order everywhere in the vast region of the western Canadian frontier. They have fine horses which can gallop immense distances in a very short time. Farther east we find rich farming lands, the soil of which will raise excellent wheat, and at Winnipeg, after a car ride of 1,482 miles, we stop at one of the great wheat and grain centers of the world. There are immense elevators here. Winnipeg is the capital of the rich wheat province of Manitoba, which raises millions of bushels of grain every year, forming a continuation of the breadlands of the Red River Valley, which we visited after our trip up the Mississippi Valley. Winnipeg has now about 40,000 people. It commands the vast trade of the regions to the north and west. Through Lake Winnipeg and the Saskatchewan, Assiniboine, and Red Rivers, it is the trading point for a large extent of territory. A railroad has been planned to go from Winnipeg to Hudson Bay. Should this be built, ships could come from Europe during the summer through Hudson Strait, could cross Hudson Bay, and be within a few hundred miles by rail of the great wheat fields of the Canadian Northwest. If this is done, Winnipeg will be the Chicago of Canada. Leaving Winnipeg, the cars rapidly take us to Port Arthur on Lake Superior, and thence we go on through a wild, broken region, crossing many rapid rivers and skirting numerous lakes. We are seldom out of the woods, and the extensive forests of Canada grow upon us as we ride farther east through little else than trees, until, about 1,300 miles from Winnipeg, we reach Ottawa. Ottawa is the capital of Canada. It is a beautiful city. It is only about 1/6 as large as Washington, and like Washington, it was cut out of a forest. It is situated on a high bluff at the junction of the Rideau and Ottawa rivers, and as we walk through its wide streets, we can hear the murmur of the Chaudière Falls, which here break the navigation of the Ottawa River, giving water power for numerous sawmills and factories. At the highest part of the city, almost overhanging the Ottawa River, are the Parliament buildings, where the laws for Canada are made, and near them are the great department buildings, in which the government of the Dominion is directed. It is at Ottawa that the Governor-General of Canada lives. He is appointed by the ruler of England and receives a salary of £10,000, or about $50,000 a year. He has a number of advisers, or cabinet ministers, much as our president has, and it is his business to carry out the laws of Canada as enacted by the Parliament. The upper house of the Canadian Parliament is quite different from our Senate. The Canadian senators are chosen for life, ours for 6 years. Each province of Canada has the right to a certain number of senators, but the men are selected by the Governor-General instead of being chosen by the people, or legislature, as with us. The House of Commons is somewhat like our House of Representatives. Its members are elected by the people. Each representative receives $1,000 a session, or about 1/5 as much as one of our congressmen receives, and if he be absent he is fined $8 a day for the time he is away, unless his absence is caused by sickness. Parliament fixes the taxes of Canada, and all the money collected for taxes is spent in Canada, and not, as was the case with our colonies before the Revolution, sent to Great Britain. Each of the provinces of Canada has a government somewhat like that of our states, but Parliament deals with the whole of the Canadian Dominion and not with any special province. The two largest cities of Canada are Montreal and Toronto. Toronto is a thriving port on Lake Ontario. Montreal is on the St. Lawrence River, 3 hours by rail from Ottawa, or we can reach it by a sail down the Ottawa River in the steamers which go every day from one city to the other. Montreal is the New York of Canada. It is its chief commercial city and also its chief seaport. It is situated on an island formed by the junction of the Ottawa and St. Lawrence rivers. Formerly, the ocean steamers coming to Canada had to stop at Quebec because the St. Lawrence between that city and Montreal was only 11 feet deep, and this was not deep enough for large ships. In 1851, however, the river was dredged out, so that there is now a channel more than 27 feet deep all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to Montreal. We find the largest of ocean steamers at the wharves of the city, and see immense cargoes of grain which have come down the Great Lakes and through the Welland Canal being put into steamers to be carried to Europe. Just back of Montreal there is a high hill known as Mount Royal. Let us go to the top of it and take a view of the city. We ride up on an inclined railway and feast our eyes on some of the most beautiful scenery in America. Montreal, with its 250,000 people, lies below us, covering a long space on the banks of the beautiful St. Lawrence. Here and there, among the houses, rise the spires of great churches, and many beautiful parks and lines of shade trees are to be seen. There, in front of us, we see Victoria Bridge across the St. Lawrence, which, when it was built in 1860, was considered the most wonderful bridge in the world. It is made of wrought iron tubes, so fitted together that they form a rectangular pipe about 2 miles long, and so wide and high that a railroad train can easily pass through it. The bridge belongs to the Grand Trunk Railway. The stone pillars of the Victoria Bridge are so built that their upper sides extend out into the river in the shape of great plowshares. The object of this is to cut the ice as it rushes against them in the spring. The St. Lawrence is frozen during the greater part of the winter. The snow falls very heavily in Canada, and for a number of years Montreal has had a winter festival, during which the people have built a great palace of blocks of ice, which many strangers have come thousands of miles to see. Both here and in many other parts of Canada, the winter forms the jolliest part of the year. The snow lies upon the ground for months. There are skating, snowshoeing, and tobogganing. Every city has its skating rinks, many of which are lighted by electricity. Every town in Canada has its snowshoe club, and in the cities there are numerous snowshoe organizations. Each club has its own uniform, consisting of a bright-colored blanket coat and a cap, or cowl, fastened to the neck and fitting over the head. The clubs go out and run over the snow, playing games in the moonlight. They sing as they play, and the sight is a most curious one. Tobogganing is enjoyed by men, women, and children. A toboggan is a thin piece of board, about 18 inches wide, and from 4 to 8 feet long. The board is turned up at the front end. It has a very smooth bottom, and when placed on the edge of a hill with one or more passengers seated upon it, it will rush over the glassy snow with the speed of an express train. The steersman of a toboggan sits in the rear. It is his business to direct the course of the board with his hands and feet. He sometimes makes a mistake and turns himself and the others seated in front of him upside down in the snow. In our travels through the eastern part of Canada, we are surprised to find that a large portion of the people are French. There are more French than English in Quebec, and more than 1/3 of all the Canadians are of French descent. We hear little else than French spoken on the streets of Montreal. In the government offices papers are printed in both French and English, and the signs in the streets are in both languages. The markets of the cities of eastern Canada are supplied with vegetables by French-Canadian farmers, and we talk with the market men in French. The eastern part of Canada belonged for a long time to France. Then there was a great war between France and Great Britain, and in 1759 the British, under General Wolfe, climbed to the heights upon which the city of Quebec is built and captured this well-fortified town. Quebec is called the Gibraltar of America. It is situated upon a rocky bluff 300 feet above the St. Lawrence, and it has many cannon which guard this waterway from the sea into Canada. There are forts on the heights on the opposite side, so that it would be a dangerous thing for a foreign battleship to attempt to pass here on its way up the St. Lawrence. We steam down the beautiful St. Lawrence from Montreal in a night, and find ourselves at the wharves of Quebec in the morning. The place where the battle between the French and English was fought lies just back of the city, on the Plains of Abraham, and our guides tell us how both of the generals were killed during the engagement. General Wolfe fell dead on the field, having been hit 3 times, the last ball piercing his breast. Montcalm, the French general, was first struck by a musket ball and then by a discharge of the only cannon that the British had brought to the field. He was carried mortally wounded into Quebec, and at 5 o'clock the next morning he died. All this happened on September 13th, 1759. It marked the end of French rule in North America. The city of Quebec contains about 70,000 people. It is more like an old French town than a modern American city, and as we wander through its narrow streets, we can hardly believe that the town belongs to our pushing North American continent. The favorite mode of conveyance between different parts of the city is by calashes, peculiar 2-wheeled, 1-horse vehicles, which can be hired at the livery stables for 75 cents an hour. Dufferin Terrace, a grand promenade along the edge of the cliff 200 feet high, affords one of the finest views of river and mountain scenery in the world. The citadel of Quebec is a very strong fortification covering nearly 40 acres of ground. We make but a short stay in Quebec and then take the railroad for Halifax, the capital of Nova Scotia, where there are other fortifications and where the chief naval station of British America is situated. Halifax has about 35,000 inhabitants. It has an excellent harbor. Here are ships from many parts of the world at its wharves, and we have little trouble in finding a vessel which takes us to Boston. From that point we go by rail to New York, to take the line of steamers, which in 5 days carries us to Vera Cruz, the chief seaport of Mexico. End of chapter 42. Chapter 43 of Carpenter's Geographical Reader, North America. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. Carpenter's Geographical Reader, North America, by Frank Carpenter. Chapter 43. Spanish North America, Mexico. Mexico is within a few days' ride of any part of the United States, but as we land in Vera Cruz, we seem to be in another world. The faces of the people are darker than ours. They speak Spanish, and we must have a Mexican guide who understands English to take us about. Many of the men wear hats with brims a foot wide and bands of silver and gold as thick as your wrist. Not a few have on jackets, or short coats, embroidered with silver braid, pantaloons the legs of which are ornamented with silver buttons, and leather belts from which silver-mounted revolvers hang. The dress of the women seems strange. The ladies we see on the streets wear black, and some have shawls over their heads, like those worn by the women of Spain. The poorer people are dressed in cotton. They have features somewhat like those of our Indians, but they are shorter in stature and do not look so strong. Nearly all of the men wear big hats, and not a few have red blankets, which they drape picturesquely about their shoulders. The women wear cotton dresses and have shawls on their heads in place of hats or bonnets. What queer houses we see in the towns! They are flat-roofed, and very few of them have chimneys. The people use charcoal for cooking, and Vera Cruz is so hot that you do not need a fire to keep warm. How gay the walls look! They are painted red, yellow, or bright blue. They extend to the edges of the sidewalks, and the windows of the ground floors have iron bars like those of a prison. How beautiful the flowers and trees are! We are now in the land of the tropics. There is a palm tree, and that long-leaved plant beside it is loaded down with bananas. We are now in what is known as Spanish North America. All the country between the United States and the Isthmus of Panama belonged for centuries to Spain. The Spaniards came across the Atlantic and conquered the Indians, and divided up the land among themselves. Some of the Spaniards married Indian women, and today Spanish North America is inhabited by the descendants of the Spaniards, by those of the Spaniards who married the Indians, and by the descendants of the Indians who lived here at the time Columbus discovered America. The different countries, however, long ago rebelled against Spain. They now have their own governments. Mexico is almost 1/5 as large as the whole United States, including Alaska. Take your map of North America and see how the country is shaped. Does it not look much like a great horn, the roots of which are fastened to the United States, and the tip ending in Yucatan on the coast of the Caribbean Sea? Mexico is formed like a horn also, in that it slopes very steeply upward on both sides from the sea, its top forming a high, irregular plateau, which lies in most places more than a mile above the surface of the Gulf of Mexico, or the Pacific Ocean. It is on the inner curve of the horn that we land at Vera Cruz, and as our cars climb up the railroad from the coast to the plateau, we get some idea of the many climates Mexico has. Along the coast it is exceedingly hot. It is unhealthful here during a great part of the year, especially in the rainy season when the water falls in torrents. We ride for miles through groves of palm trees, on the tops of which bunches of coconuts hang. We pass thickets of bamboo canes, whose feathery branches extend high above the roofs of the cars. Here are mahogany trees and ebony trees, and there are vines bearing vanilla beans, from which comes the extract we use in flavoring ice cream, soda water, and cake. The forests are full of curious flowers. Hundreds of orchids, or air plants, hang to the branches, and there are so many of these choice blossoms that we could have a carload for the picking. There are birds of bright colors flying about through the trees, and the mockingbirds whistle at us as we go by. We soon reach the hills and begin to go upward. The ascent is so steep that a double engine is needed. We rise in one place 1,000 feet in 20 miles, and in another we go upward 4,000 feet in 29 miles. The engine puffs and groans as it pulls us about the sides of the mountains, dragging us through tunnel after tunnel, hauling us over iron bridges, now twisting this way and now winding that, until at last, after having dragged us more than 1.5 miles above the sea, it lands us at Esperanza, at the beginning of the plateau which forms the greater part of Mexico. In our trip upward we have gone through 6 different climates. We first rode through groves of orange and lemon trees. We passed by fields of pineapples, the red roots or bodies of which shone out below the green leaves against the dark ground. Pineapples, we learn, grow much like cabbages, and those which the Indian women bring to the cars, fresh and ripe from the fields, are far more delicious than any sold in our markets. A little farther on we passed through what we at first thought were banana plantations. The fields were filled with the tall, wide-leaved banana plants, but between them were bushes covered with dark green leaves and filled with bright red berries, each about as big around as a small chestnut. We saw Indians picking these berries and were told that they were gathering coffee, and that each of the berries contained 2 of the seeds which form the coffee of commerce. When we asked as to the bananas, we learned that they are planted to shade the coffee bushes, and that the coffee is by far the more valuable product. Coffee plants are first grown from the seed in nurseries. They are then set out in the field and are cultivated. At the age of 5 years they produce beautiful crops. They continue to yield for about 10 years, each bush giving from 1 to 5 pounds of coffee a year. After the berries are gathered, they are crushed to get the hulls from the seeds, and the seeds are then dried and cleaned for the market. Some of the best coffee of the world is raised in Mexico, and there are large plantations in those parts of the country lying between the plateau and the sea. The most of the Mexican plateau is too cool to produce tropical fruits. Its climate is a temperate one and exceedingly healthful. The weather the year round is much like that of an Ohio June. The tops of the mountains along the borders of this great tableland are covered with perpetual snow. The air is so pure that we can see many miles. The sky seems closer to the earth than at home, and at night the moon shines with a greater brilliancy, and the stars are more than ever like diamonds. It is on the Mexican plateau that most of the people live. There are railroads which connect the larger cities, many of which are more than 1 mile above the sea. In the northern part of Mexico, the plateau has many deserts like those we saw among the Rockies on our way to San Francisco. Here the only plants which grow are the cacti and the sagebrush. The ground is white and glaring, and as we cross the deserts on the railroads, our eyes grow sore and our nostrils are filled with a suffocating dust. The surface of the plateau is rolling. Out of it rise many mountains containing gold and silver. It has rich valleys and well-watered plains, many of which are divided up into enormous farms called haciendas. What would you think of traveling for 80 miles on a railroad through one man's farm? There are haciendas even larger than that in Mexico, upon which great herds of cattle, droves of horses, and flocks of sheep and goats are pastured. There are plantations farther south upon which vast crops of tobacco and cotton are grown, and wheat, corn, and barley can be raised almost anywhere upon the watered parts of the tableland. There are few countries where crops grow so luxuriantly as in Mexico. The farmers use the poorest of tools. Many of the plows are forked sticks shod with iron, which merely scratch the surface of the ground. Still, some of the land is so rich that it will produce 2 crops a year, and I have seen men harvesting in one field while the same kind of crop was being planted in the field adjoining. We can pick roses almost anywhere in Mexico from January to December, and should we ride north from Mexico City, we would pass through sections of the country where strawberries are ripe all the year round. In our travels we see many curious plants. The cactus grows everywhere upon the highlands. There are many species of cacti in Mexico, some of which are very valuable. You may have seen century plants in the hothouses of the United States. There is a species of this plant family which grows best in Yucatan. It is known as henequen, or sisal hemp, and it is of great value on account of its fibers. The cactus leaves are composed of long threads or fibers which, when prepared, can be used for the making of hammocks, bagging, or ropes. Many of the hammocks we use in America are woven by the Indian women of Yucatan. There is another species of cactus which grows near Mexico City, the juice of which, if kept a few days, turns into a beer which the natives greedily drink. This species is the maguey plant. We passed through vast plantations of maguey on our way to the Mexican capital. The full-grown plants are so big that you could not crowd the smallest of them into a hogshead. They have leaves from 6 to 8 inches thick, which sprout up from the ground to the height of 10 or 12 feet. Inside the leaves there is a green cone, as big around as a peck measure, and when the plant is ripe, this cone is cut out, leaving a bowl which will hold about 2 gallons. Into this queer bowl the sap runs down from the leaves in streams, each plant producing from 8 to 15 quarts of juice every day. And as this yield will continue for 6 months, you can see that a single plant will produce several barrels of liquor. The juice is quite sweet at first, and it is as clear as spring water. It begins to ferment in a very few hours, and within a day it is turned to beer, and will make you drunk if you take too much of it. End of chapter 43. Chapter 44 of Carpenter's Geographical Reader, North America. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. Chapter 44. Travels in Mexico. We remain some time in the city of Mexico, and from there take trips by rail and stage to different parts of the country. Mexico has now thousands of miles of railway, reaching all parts of the plateau and the harbors on the east and west coasts. The most of these roads have been recently built, and we can travel through many sections of country which until now have been almost unknown to the rest of the world. There is good order everywhere, and we cannot see why so many Mexicans should carry revolvers. It is because the country for years was filled with brigands, and it was then not safe to travel alone. Now, however, there is peace everywhere, and we ride on donkeys for miles through the mountains. We can get a good idea of the cities of Mexico by a look at the capital. The best view of Mexico City can be had from the spire of the great cathedral, which stands in its center. Let us climb to the top and take a bird's-eye view of the city. We are now 200 feet above the ground, looking down upon one of the most picturesque cities of North America. The Mexican capital lies in a beautiful valley surrounded by mountains. Off in the distance, the 2 great volcanoes of Popocatépetl and the White Woman look down upon us out of their caps of perpetual snow, and the green fields of the valley are spotted here and there with lakes, which shine like great shields of diamonds under the bright rays of the southern sun. The city below looks like a checkerboard. It is divided into squares of houses roofed with brick, and the streets which bound the squares are of cobblestones. As we look down, we see that the roofs of all Mexican houses are flat. There is not a bit of smoke rising from them. There are not a dozen chimneys in the whole city, for the houses are heated with charcoal, and the cooking is done with the same fuel in little clay ovens. There are few furnaces in Mexico, and iron cooking stoves are almost unknown. On the tops of many of the houses we see white and gay-colored patches floating to and fro in the breeze. These are the family washings, which are often dried upon the roofs. Farther out upon the edges of the canals, at the outskirts of the city, there are other patches of white, and you see that much of the washing of Mexico is done in the streams, the most of the clothes being washed in cold water. Notice how the houses are built. Few of them are more than 3 stories in height. They stand close to the sidewalks around little courts which form yards or gardens. Every large Mexican house has a court of this kind. There are flowers and trees growing in it. Just below us, in front of the cathedral, there is a large square, known as the plaza, where the band plays every evening and where the people come to walk about under the trees. Such plazas are to be found in every Mexican city. The people are fond of music, and they spend much time out of doors. That long 3-story building at the side of the plaza below us is the National Palace, where the Congress of Mexico sits, and where the officers of the government work. Mexico is a republic, much like the United States. It is in that building that the president receives his callers, and about him, in other rooms, are the chief offices of the government departments. What a number of churches there are, rising out above the rest of the houses! All Mexican cities have fine church buildings. The chief religion of the people is Roman Catholic, and for years the church owned a vast deal of all kinds of property. Some time ago, however, the government thought that the church had too much influence upon the people. It therefore confiscated many of the church buildings, and we shall see old monasteries and convents that are now used for public schools. Some have been sold for factories and others for hotels. But let us go down from the cathedral and take a walk through the city. It is now just after noon, and we find the streets almost deserted. The Mexicans close their stores at 12 o'clock and rest during the hot hours of the day. They have their dinners between 12 and 1, after which they take a nap or chat with their families until 3, when they come back to work. The business hours are in fact from 9 to 12 in the morning and from 3 to 6 in the afternoon. By 7 o'clock most of the establishments are closed, and the evening is given up to rest or to pleasure. After 7 the poorer people go out to walk in the parks, and those who have carriages drive out upon the Paseo, the wide road which runs between the city and the great hill called Chapultepec, on which is the summer home of the president. We are surprised to see how many poor people there are. There are hundreds of thousands who work for a few cents a day, and there are thousands of families supported in Mexico on less than $1 a week. The Spaniards and the mestizos, or the descendants of Spaniards and Indians, own the greater part of the wealth. The Indians, of whom there are several millions, and the poor of the mestizos form the laboring class. They get in debt to their employers and work on from year to year, taking only a part of their wages from day to day, and allowing the remainder to go toward the payment of that which they owe. They borrow more from time to time, and thus keep themselves all their lives in a sort of debt slavery. Such slaves are known as peons, and the poorer classes of Mexico are generally called peons. We see many peons in Mexico City. The men dress as a rule in white cotton shirts and pantaloons. The shirt is outside of the pantaloons, and the pantaloons fall to the feet. The peon does not wear stockings. His feet are shod with sandals of thick leather. He wears a broad-brimmed hat with a crown a foot high, and a red blanket which he throws about his shoulders. The peon woman usually goes barefooted and bareheaded. Her dress is of cotton, and her only additional garment is a shawl, which she drapes around her shoulders and sometimes draws over her head. We see many of the peons in the market. They bring vegetables, eggs, and other things on their backs from their little farms miles away from the city. They squat down under umbrellas, and with their wares piled up before them, offer them for sale. Indian corn forms the chief food of the people. The most of the people of Mexico do not know what bread is, and hundreds of thousands have never tasted wheat flour. There are vast numbers who have never had meal ground in a mill. Every peon woman is her own cook and her own miller. Outside of almost any Mexican hut, we can see a woman preparing her Indian corn for food. She does this by means of two stones. One is a rough slab about a foot wide and 18 inches long, and the other is a round stone such as we use for whetting scythes. The woman first soaks the grains of corn in lime water until they are soft. She lays them on the slab, and getting down on her knees behind it, rubs them with the round stone into a paste or dough. She presses this with her hand into the shape of a griddle cake, and then lays it upon a charcoal fire to cook. And in a short time the bread for the family is made. These cakes are called tortillas. We taste them and find them quite good. The peons eat them without butter, though they sometimes use salt and red pepper for seasoning them. There is one dish that we shall find well served in every Mexican house. This dish is black beans, which the Mexican call frijoles. Frijoles are eaten by both the rich and the poor. It is not an uncommon thing to have them brought in at the close of the meal. The Mexicans have very good candies, and you will find delicious chocolate everywhere. At noon, the better classes have a good dinner, each dish being brought in and served separately, and not all at once as with us. None but the rich can afford meat, and in some cities the way meat is sold makes us think that it would be dear at almost any price. I once saw a butcher peddling beef in the Mexican city of Guanajuato. His meat wagon moved about on legs instead of wheels. It was a dirty, one-eyed mule. Upon the mule's back there was a frame-like saddle covered with hooks. The pieces of meat hung from the hooks down the sides of the animal, the blood from them dripping to the ground as the mule walked along. The mountain districts of Mexico are among the most interesting parts of the country. Since the discovery of America, much of the silver of the world has been taken from the Mexican mines, and there are mines here which have produced tens of millions of dollars worth of silver. The Mexican Indians had vast quantities of gold and silver when the Spaniards conquered them. Montezuma, the Indian emperor, gave Cortez, the Spanish general, plates of gold and silver as big as wagon wheels, and his people made spurs of gold for the Spanish horsemen. Today, more than 1,000 mines are being worked in Mexico, and more than 200,000 men are employed in getting out the precious metals. But before we leave Mexico, we must see a volcano. Mexico has a number of these wonderful mountains, which now and then vomit forth lava, steam, and sulfur. We can see Popocatépetl from any part of Mexico City, and we resolve to climb it. Popocatépetl is one of the greatest volcanoes, and it is one of the highest mountains on this continent. It is more than 17,000 feet high, or more than 3 miles above the level of the sea. We ride over a railroad to the town of Amica Mecca, which lies at the foot of the mountain. Here we take guides who carry our overcoats for us. We each have a stick to keep us from falling, and the guides have ropes to help us over the icy and rough places. For the first few hours we go through a pine forest. Then we climb up hills of volcanic rock through loose, shifting black sand. As we rise higher, the trees are smaller, and at last we come to a point where nothing at all grows. We soon reach the snow line, where, from year's end to year's end, the snow never melts. The snow is soft at first, but as we rise it becomes harder and harder. The air grows colder and thinner, and at times we feel a little faint and sick. How our hearts beat! The glare of the hot Mexican sun on the snow dazzles our eyes, and our hands are torn in pulling ourselves from point to point over the ice. At last we reach the top and stand at the edge of the crater of the greatest volcano in North America. Popocatépetl is not now throwing stones, rock and lava into the air, but it is always vomiting out fumes of sulfur. We have to get to the windward of the volumes of blue and yellow brimstone smoke which rise out of the great hole in the top of the mountain, and then we can look down within. The top of the crater is almost a mile wide, and the hole is more than 1,000 feet deep. The walls slope inward as they go down, and by peeping in we can see scores of Indians at work gathering the sulfur and carrying it to the top. From there it is slid down the mountain in a sort of trough, or chute, to be prepared for the markets. The sulfur of Popocatépetl is said to be the purest in the world, and a great quantity of it is taken out and sold every year. End of chapter 44. Chapter 45 of Carpenter's Geographical Reader, North America. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. Carpenter's Geographical Reader, North America, by Frank Carpenter. Chapter 45, Central America. Today we leave Mexico for a trip through Central America. In going from the southern boundary of Mexico to the Isthmus of Panama, we have to travel almost as far as from New York to Chicago. The journey requires several days if taken by sea, and should we go the whole way by land, we would be months in getting from one point to the other. Central America is not thickly populated. It has not, in all its states together, as many people as there are in the city of New York. The people are much like the Mexicans, save that there are more Indians among them. The country is not unlike Mexico, with tropical lowlands and a strip of plateau upon which are high volcanic mountains. In the mountains we see men and women at work, mining gold and silver. In some places the Indian women are washing gold out of the streams. The climate of Central America is hotter than that of Mexico. It grows warmer and warmer as we go southward, and on the lowlands the vegetation becomes more and more tropical. We find excellent coffee lands in many of the states. In Honduras, we visit plantations where vast quantities of bananas are raised for the American markets. The plants are started from suckers pulled from the banana plants already grown. The suckers are set in the earth about 15 feet apart. They grow rapidly, soon reaching a height far above your head, and spreading out their long, wide leaves. At the age of 10 months, the first fruit can be gathered. Large bunches of green bananas now hang down from the stalks of the plant. They are pulled down almost to the ground, and then the stalk is cut next to the fruit with a long knife. The bananas are cut when they are green and put upon shipboard for export. It takes several days for them to reach our markets, and they have time to ripen during the voyage. Another product of Central America, which finds its way to all parts of the United States, is chocolate, or cocoa. It is made from the seeds of the fruit of the cacao tree, which is cultivated in Mexico and Central America. The tree is planted just as we plant peach or apple trees. It is carefully cared for, and after a few years it bears a red or green fruit, about 8 inches long, in which are the seeds known as chocolate nuts or cacao beans. The seeds are very oily, and they are allowed to ferment before they are dried. They are ground up into a powder, some of the oil being taken out in the process of preparation. The powder, pressed into cakes, forms the chocolate which is sold in our stores. Much of our journey in Central America must be through the forests. No other part of the Grand Division has such dense woods as are found here. The trees grow to a great height and thickness. They are bound together by snake-like vines, and the vegetation is so dense that in passing through the woods it is impossible to advance more than a few miles each day. Travel is quite dangerous in the forest regions. There are many poisonous snakes. There are centipedes, scorpions, vipers, and all sorts of horrible creeping things. We see many wild beasts. There are panthers and jaguars. There are herds of peccaries, or wild hogs, and monkeys by the hundreds jump from tree to tree. There are hummingbirds not much larger than bumblebees. There are wild parrots and other birds of the most gorgeous plumage. Here and there, in the woods, we find lumber camps where men are cutting down mahogany, ebony, and rosewood trees to be shipped to all parts of the world for making furniture. The camps are usually on the banks of a river, the lumber being dragged by oxen to the stream and floated down to the seacoast. A mahogany camp consists of a collection of log cabins in which from 30 to 50 men live and work under an overseer called a captain. There is one man among them who is known as the hunter, who goes through the forest and picks out the trees fit for cutting. This man knows a mahogany tree as far as he can see it, and he understands just how large it should be to make good lumber. The mahogany grows to an enormous size in Central America, the trunks of some trees being 60 feet high before the branches begin. At certain times of the year, the leaves of the mahogany are colored as brightly as the leaves of our forests in autumn. It is this color which forms the guide to the hunter, who, having climbed to the top of some high tree, picks out with his eye the places where the mahogany trees are, and plans just how to get to them. No trees are cut down which are less than 8 feet in circumference, and it has been calculated that a mahogany tree must be 300 years old before it is ready for lumber. The wood is of such value that it brings high prices everywhere. There are also India rubber trees. These trees in Central America do not grow more than 50 feet high. Sometimes, in gathering the sap, the rubber trees are cut down. Sometimes they are left standing, and the bark is cut away in strips from the top of the tree to its roots. Holes are made in the ground at the ends of the strips, and these are so plastered with leaves that they make a bowl in which the sap is caught as it oozes out and rolls down. After the sap has been collected, it is allowed to harden and is then kneaded into cakes for the markets. The cities of Central America are few. All of them are small, and we find them not unlike the Mexican towns we have visited. Many of them are back from the sea, and few of the interior cities can be reached by railroad from the Pacific coast. But there are a number of good harbors along the coast. As we near the Isthmus of Panama, we find that the country grows more and more narrow, until, at the town of Panama, the distance between the Pacific coast and that of the Caribbean Sea is only 45 miles. Is not this a narrow strip of land which ties the two divisions of America together? Yes, indeed, but with its rough highlands it is big enough to form a great barrier to the east and west commerce of the world. Could we sink the Isthmus of Panama or a slice of Central America under the sea, ships, in going from New York to San Francisco, would not have to sail round South America. A distance of more than 8,000 land miles would be saved, and Asia would be several weeks nearer our Atlantic coast and Europe. The advantages of such a route are so great that plans have been formed to make canals through the Isthmus of Panama and through that part of Central America farther north in which Lake Nicaragua lies. Lake Nicaragua is about half the size of Lake Ontario. It has an outlet to the Caribbean Sea through the San Juan River, and by means of locks, such as we saw at the St. Mary's Falls, steamships might be lifted through this river into the lake, and thence, by a short canal, from the west coast of Lake Nicaragua down into the Pacific Ocean. Our government is much interested in this undertaking, and it is probable that the canal will sometime be completed. At present, however, there is no chance to get across Central America by sea, so we take the little railroad that runs from one side of the Isthmus of Panama to the other, and within a few hours find ourselves at the town of Colon, on the Caribbean Sea. From this place we take a ship which lands us again in New York. End of chapter 45. End of Geographical Reader, North America, by Frank Carpenter.